I'm Mark Gagan and you're listening to the Voice of Insurance podcast, produced in association with Advantage Go, enabling enterprise-scale underwriting through a single pane of glass. Today's guest has done something that only happens once in a generation. He's helped found a new insurance industry trade body. Most insurance trade groupings tend to feel as if they've been around forever. Rightly so, because in various shapes or forms, most of them have. New bodies only tend to be born because something has changed in the market that requires them to come into existence. Here, the big change is the growth in MGAs on the continent of Europe, and the new trade body is called FASE, the Fédération of European MGAs, or more correctly in its French and Latin language friendly version, the Fédération des Agences de Souscription Européennes. Today's guest is FASE's Executive Director, William Pitt, and this podcast is all about finding out what has brought about FASE's inception and what needs in the European MGA community it is intending to serve. William has had a remarkable career in insurance on both sides of the underwriting desk, as well as in consultancy, insurance marketing, and indeed insurance journalism. He's both passionate and articulate about the forum that FASE is looking to provide for the industry and the fundamental drivers behind the seemingly inexorable growth in this part of the global insurance value chain. This makes for a really informative and thought-provoking discussion. You'll learn a lot, and by the end of this podcast, you'll be wondering why FASE didn't come into existence far sooner. Enjoy the podcast.
William, welcome to the Voice of Insurance.
Thank you, Mark. Delighted to be with you.
Anyone out there who's listening who doesn't know you, why don't you run us through your career today? How did your relationship with the insurance industry start, and how did you get where you are today?
So it's been the fairly classic thing about not necessarily targeting insurance at the beginning. I was actually a journalist, Mark, and I was covering the insurance market, and I was covering the Lloyd's market in particular in the 1990s.
Wow, so you're a very busy man.
And busy at the time, yes. And I became busier because I reached out to David Rowland, who was at the time the chairman of Lloyd's. And I slightly naively said to him, and this has some bearing on what we're going to be talking about the European insurance market and MGAs in that context. I reached out to David to suggest that I might be able to help Lloyd's raise its profile and strengthen its business in continental Europe. And he came back to me to say, well, that's very kind of you to suggest that, but we've actually got rather more pressing concerns at the moment. And maybe you can help us with that. So I joined Lloyd's in the mid-90s to support the creation of what became Equitas. And that became part of the overall Lloyd's reconstruction plan. And I was very much in the thick of that. And that was a great introduction to the London market in that sense. And very pleased to have had a role in that. And so that was how I started.
That is quite a crucible to have been forged. If you survive that, you've come out stronger, I think. Very interesting times. Interesting what you were saying about continental Europe. At that time, I was working for a Spanish insurance broker. And in fact, there was at the height of the sort of reconstruction renewal, I think Lloyd's Bank, which was a retail bank in Spain at the time, took out full page adverts in the local press to say, we are not Lloyd's of London, because they were worried about a run on the bank, people coming to asking for their money back because they'd read something about Lloyd's. It was a really interesting time to be working. Which publications did you write for before you joined Lloyd's?
So I was writing for Post magazine, and I did some work with a publication called the Report.
Oh, yes, I remember. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So, yeah, focusing on that part of the market.
And of course, Post, yes, still going as, I think now rebranded to Insurance Post, but excellent. Of course, I think Post has been going in various forms since goodness knows when, since Victorian times.
Well, it was founded in 1840 as a general interest gentleman's publication. Didn't cover insurance for the first 10 years. And then I think from about 1850, it started to cover insurance and then didn't look back.
So get to the meat of why you're on the show. Why have you founded the Fédération des Agences de Souscription Européennes, which is translated as the European MGA Association? Federation, not association, sorry.
Well, congratulations on your pronunciation, Mark. That's beautiful. It trips off your tongue anyway, not necessarily off everybody's. But so we can talk a little bit more about the name, but the reason we've founded it is that the European MGA market is substantial. It's growing. I think it has huge potential for further growth, driven by global drivers of the growth of the MGA model. But there are some restraints or constraints on the growth of the market as well. it is not a very transparent market. MGAs across Europe vary very widely in form and in the level of their activity and in their profile. Most people, including people who should know what an MGA is in continental Europe, don't know what an MGA is, what it does, and how it adds value. And so I've been talking for quite some time with MGAs building business in Europe about the potential value of a pan-European federation of MGAs that really brings the market closer together and improves the transparency of the market, helps people understand the role that MGAs play, helps MGAs identify capacity providers, helps capacity providers identify MGAs. There are two markets, really, I think, Mark, and we're talking about and thinking about sort of how we can bring them together. There's the MGA market, which is organizations with incredible local expertise and knowledge across Europe of the markets that they're serving. And then there's the global market, which is the market for capacity. And those two markets do not interface or interact that efficiently at the moment. And so the overall goal over time is to bring them close together and enhance the transparency between the two so that that can drive the growth of MGAs in Europe.
So it sounds like you want to be more of a platform to connect everybody together than necessarily a lobbying group, for example, or would you also want to be doing that? Of course, if someone in Brussels is about to put out a directive that is failed to take MGAs into account, for example, then presumably you'd be getting on the plane, getting on the train and going to talk to them.
So a couple of things on that. We did some research, as you would expect, to see what people might want from an organization of this kind. And they came back with two answers above all others. There were a lot of things that they wanted, actually, but this was with MGAs. One was a forum for the market to come together. And so this is this original concept that was mentioned. And the other was some help and support on the regulatory side, which is, to your point, it's interesting because MGAs are proverbially lightly regulated organizations by comparison with balance sheet insurance companies. But nevertheless, there is this patchwork quilt of regulation around Europe, which is quite frustrating and difficult to navigate for MGAs as they seek to expand their business in Europe. And so that came back as, yes, we would like some help in that. Now, how we can help on that, I think, is first and foremost to help them understand that regulatory landscape. And if you're in Spain and you want to write business in France or in Germany or in Portugal, what does that entail? What do you need to do? So I think that there is quite a lot of work we can do in that with experts in that field to say this is the way it works in Germany and this is what you need to do. The lobbying point is a little bit down the track, and I don't want to get ahead of our skis in terms of how we can help in that. I think we're going to need to think quite carefully about how we can help in that. Ultimately, the goal would be to see if we can help harmonize regulation around Europe in a way that is supportive for MGAs as they seek to grow internationally.
I had a podcast celebrating Dual's anniversary, I think it was 20th or maybe the 25th anniversary. It was very interesting that Dual had its first formation in Spain, and Spain actually didn't have a definition of the concept of a managing general agent, as or would be described in Spanish would be, a subscription agency or, an underwriting agency.
Underwriting agency, yep.
An underwriting agency. They had tied agents. You go into any Spanish town, you'll see your Generali and you'll see your Zurich and you'll see your Mapfre tied agent, who's only going to sell you their products. And you do have insurance brokers, of course, who are independent, but you don't have someone who's a bit of both, who's someone who's an independent underwriter. There was not a legal concept that existed necessarily. And of course, but then it was made to be.
But that's still the case today, in a lot of countries, effectively, the legal concept is a broker, and a broker owes a fiduciary duty to the client. The MGA owes the fiduciary duty to the insurer.
Absolutely.
So it's a fundamentally different structure, different entity, and that is not fully appreciated or even reflected in the regulatory landscape.
And obviously, before we go any further, William, of course, we've got to get our abbreviation sorted out. This is the insurance industry after all. So we've got, it's the FASE, Fédération de Souscription Européennes. And then you're going to call it, not FASE, you're going to call it FASE. That's how you refer to it.
In the English-speaking world, I think that's the easiest pronunciation. Yes, I mean, we wanted a simple name like that, but also we really liked the Agences de Souscription concept because it does what it says on the tin, if you like. It's an underwriting agency. And that's what they're called in Australia, actually, underwriting agencies. I think in many ways that's a better term than MGA. MGA is very opaque as an expression.
Could be anything, actually, yes.
Yeah. I mean, in managing general agency, what is it you're managing, right? I mean, it could be anything. And then, of course, there are these subtle differences between MGAs and MGUs that people talk about. And I think we totted it up at one point, and I think there are about 7 or 8 different expressions around the world in English alone.
Well, so yes, you throw in program manager and you get very confused.
Program administrator. There are lots of expressions, but underwriting agency, I think, has that appropriate stress on underwriting, which is absolutely core to what they do. It is also probably the most widespread term in Europe, because in every Latin language, in French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and of course, Romanian, it's the same. So the name FASE is the same in all of those languages.
But also an agent, I think legally, most places in the world, there will be some law of agency and a lot of precedent around what an agent is supposed to do on behalf of the person who's given them that agency.
Yeah. And if you look as well, Mark, at sort of whole evolution of this and on why the accent on underwriting is important, I think that's the big evolution that we've seen in the MGA model over the past 20 years. The underwriting has become more and more important. It is less a distribution channel for carriers in the way that it used to be. And the underwriting autonomy, in a sense, that the MGA has become much more important. We've seen this amazing migration of talent, underwriting talent, into MGAs around the world. So that was something we wanted to get across.
Yes. Most of the large insurance economies of Europe have got a trade body of some description. In the UK, we've got the MGAA, for example. And there are equivalent trade bodies in most of the large insurance economies of Europe. How do you work with them? How will you dovetail with them and make sure you don't duplicate their work?
Well, the first thing to say is that there are some significant economies, including Germany and France, that have no representation at present for MGAs. And if you look at the GDP of the European Economic Area, about 2/3 of it is actually derives from countries that have no representation for MGAs. So there, that situation that we're starting with. But in those countries where there are local national MGA associations, we're going to be working very closely with them. And they are represented on our advisory board to help us steer the direction of FASE. And what they do is perform a range of functions locally in their local markets. So if you look at the MGAA in the UK, it is a very active organization acting on behalf of its members in regulatory areas, the kind that you were talking about, in terms of bringing the market together. It's got capacity providers, MGAs, service providers, all under the same roof, as we do at FASE, but within the UK. And so I think what we're doing is entirely complementary to that. It's bringing this market together at the European level, and we've had terrific support. We've just brought onto the advisory board the heads of the Dutch MGA Association, which is the oldest in Europe. It's been going for 65 years. And the Italian MGA Association, which is the youngest in Europe. It was just formed last year. So we are keen that those countries that don't have local MGA associations actually set one up. I think that would be very desirable, because there is a limit to what we can do locally in those markets or would want to do. So I think it's a really complementary and a strong relationship. And we're going to be working very closely with them to say, well, how can we add value over and above what you're already doing?
Just rewinding a bit, when did the idea come to you? When did you have this eureka moment? Or
I don't know if there was a eureka moment either in the bath or over lunch or whatever, but I've seen, because I've been based in the US for quite a long time, I've seen the growth of the US market and the evolution of the US market. And the sense that I had very strongly was that this was an extraordinary evolution and change. The growth has been huge in the US. It's been a kind of disaggregation of the value chain, and the role of MGAs within the value chain has been growing dramatically. And the drivers of that growth did not seem to me to be purely US drivers. It was most manifest in the US, but you could see it in other well-established MGA markets like Australia and Canada as well, and in the Netherlands, in continental Europe, and of course in the UK. And so following on from that, you say the growth drivers are strong, but there are some constraints on the growth in Europe. We talked a little bit about regulation. Some of the sizes of the markets, the target addressable markets for MGAs are not necessarily quite as large as they are in the US at the moment. And also there was this whole sort of multi-speed, opaque nature to the European market, which seemed, I thought, to sort of hinder its potential for growth. So we started talking with MGAs, started talking with local MGA associations about the value of this. And the response has been, I would say, Mark, uniformly positive. I really haven't spoken to a single person involved in this market, whether it's on the carrier side or the MGA side, service provider side, who says, nah, I don't think there's any real value in that, or maybe the time's not right, or whatever. It's just been almost a groundswell of support for something like this. In the US, as you know, there is a great organization called Target Markets, which has been bringing the market together, the program manager market, as it's called in the US, program administrator market, together for 25 years now. And it's played a significant and valuable role in the market. So some of that is obviously what we want to do in Europe as well.
So yes, to borrow an American phrase, that perhaps the thesis of FASE is that there's a sort of manifest destiny of Europe is to have more MGAs. We are going to do the same thing, and we're perhaps a little behind, but does it seem to you an inevitability that we're going to develop in the same way?
I think along similar but distinct lines, absolutely. I think that this is the direction of travel of the market because MGAs add enormous value. They're very attractive to talent, the best performing talent. You can build value within an MGA. You can have some entrepreneurial autonomy if you want that to really build a business. So we've seen that migration of talent on a huge scale in the US and to a significant degree in the UK as well. I think that's developing in continental Europe too. They're very attractive to investors because they are asset light insurance enterprises, fee-based income predominantly that is appealing. They are attractive to capacity providers because you don't have to set up your own team to focus on a particular potentially promising niche. But will it be that promising? Will it actually justify the creation of an entire dedicated in-house team? So that's the long-term attraction of MGAs to capacity providers. And I think they're very attractive to brokers as well, actually. And this is perhaps something which we can do some work with. There's some interesting ongoing studies in the UK that show that broker service from MGAs is often better than the service you get from carriers because MGAs are very focused on their particular market and they really care about the service they're providing to brokers and to brokers' clients. So I think all of those things are pushing the model forward, Mark, and to that extent, it's going to be the same story in Europe as it has been in the US.
It's a permanent change in the way we're doing business. What about the role of technology in that? This is something that probably would have been difficult to do 30 years ago. And of course, one of the other things that a lot of those MGAs can have is they can actually have newer technology than some of the carriers that are backing them, of course.
Absolutely. I mean, MGAs have been huge beneficiaries of the cloud-based SaaS revolution, if you like, in insurance. They've grasped that, and it initially, in a sense, leveled the playing field with the big carriers. They could really invest in these systems now on an affordable way. They could rent these systems, and they picked up that ball and ran with it. And we've seen over the past, I would say, 15 years, what you describe as coming to pass, that MGAs are perceived, I think rightly, as being better very often at integrating new technology into their operations than carriers with their legacy systems and tech debt and all of the challenges that they have. And that's not in any sense a negative reflection on the carriers. It's just a difficult position for them to be in because they have got a whole lot of history in this space. You actually do see it with some of the larger and really well-established MGAs. They can also have some of those legacy challenges. But for the most part, MGAs are much better at integrating technology, I think, into their operations.
So to summarize that, I suppose now the technology is allowing an underwriter to say, well, yes, I don't have to do all the other stuff. I don't have to have the big balance sheet and investor relations and finance department. In that sense, I do underwriting and I can get paid for my underwriting and I live or die by my underwriting. I don't have to worry about the other parts of that long insurance value chain. I can focus on what I'm really good at. And I suppose that's what the technology has allowed us to do. And I suppose that's why people are going for it.
Absolutely. That's a real sea change in the market, to be honest. This is, I think, why it's such an exciting space. And that's what we've seen. And that is coming to Europe. And it's evolving in Europe as it has elsewhere.
If you had to boil it down, so what is actually enabling all this to happen? This is why it's happening now. Would that be the reason?
Yeah, I think it's two things. I think you're absolutely right about the technology. And I think it's this talent migration, because the talent is, people are social animals, aren't we? And so, there are quite a lot of things go into a decision. If you're at an insurance company and you're thinking about, is an MGA in my future, setting up an MGA or joining an MGA in my future, quite a lot of things go into that. And I think what we've seen in the US is that it became an extremely respectable, indeed admirable, an enviable thing to do in many cases. So a lot of people started to sort of make the move when there was that perceived change, really, in what you could do within an MGA and how you could be a master of your own destiny, build your own business, derive a lot of value from that. And that was sort of drivers of the migration of talent. Similar story, I think, in the UK. And that's really happening in Europe now as well.
I think perhaps in the past, if you have a spurt of MGA growth, you'd say it was symptomatic of a softening market. It's often where carriers want to get hold of more distribution, i.e., they're finding it hard to get the business and to get the growth that they want. Actually, what's happening in the recent hardening cycle we've had, the MGA community, we had a bit of thinning out at the beginning, but actually it continued to grow in aggregate. Would you point to that as another sign that this is a permanent change that's happened?
Absolutely. I think it's a fundamental structural change in the market with appropriate specialization around the underwriting function for a lot of lines of business in the specialty market in particular within MGAs. And that is, in that sense, immune to whether it's a soft market or a hard market. One of the things that has happened in the US as well, and we can chat about it, which I think will be interesting to see how this evolves in Europe, is that new capacity sources, hybrid fronting carriers in particular, have come into the market in a very big way and have really been the kind of fuel tank of the growth of the market, the US market, over the past 3 or 4 years. And so that is, I think, beginning to happen in Europe as well. There are a number of carriers looking to develop that model in Europe, and that will be interesting to see how that evolves too.
Again, another thing, we've seen a huge amount of growth in market share from those hybrid carriers. They're out there sort of encouraging, nurturing and shepherding and managing that relationship that those MGAs will have with reinsurance capital particularly, and with other alternative capital, ultimate investor capital.
Yeah.
Are we going to be going on a similar journey in Europe, would you expect?
I think so. I'm always a little bit hesitant to say that Europe is behind, because I think that Europe's journey will be different in different ways. The distribution structures are quite different. As you mentioned earlier, there's much more tied agency distribution in Europe. The broking sector is not quite as strong in some of these markets. So in that sense, some European markets are harder for MGAs to penetrate. But on the capacity side, absolutely. And if you look at the US market now, I think that there's a recognition that on the fronting side, it's a pretty crowded market and arguably quite a well-saturated market. And there are more opportunities potentially for growth in Europe. And what those organizations are doing is sort of aligned with what I talked about earlier, which is that they're bringing in global capacity sources into this very local market. And that is their mission. That is their objective. So it'll be very interesting to see how that evolves and develops. There are regulatory issues, of course, for any business model in Europe that vary across the continent. So they need to be kind of navigated. But yeah, I think we'll see some real development there probably.
It's something that happens as an ecosystem grows. If you were the very first MGA, you didn't have anyone to help you. But now, as this business has grown in market share, now, of course, there are hybrid carriers to help you with your capital. Most of the brokers, the big brokers, have a division that is specifically tailored to delegated authority and MGA business and is out there finding capacity for you and marshalling that capacity. And of course, there are a wider ecosystem of all the service providers that are there to give you your IT systems and do all the other things for you. And at the same time, of course, they're even incubating sort of mega MGAs, which are allowing you to come and just as an underwriting team to plug in and have a sell. We'll take our share of your business, but you don't have to do anything, literally. You just have to be an underwriter, maintain your relationship with your distribution. Obviously, just be good at what you do, and we'll do the rest. Of course, 30 years ago, none of these things necessarily existed. Maybe the brokers still existed, but in terms of the elaborate infrastructure, of course, it just allows to grow more, of course, because there's so many people to help enable you to grow.
Absolutely. I think it's a really rich ecosystem, but it's also, it's a very varied ecosystem, and its state of development in different markets, again, in Europe, is not even. But the incubator model, I think, for example, is potentially quite relevant to Europe. If you go back to the talent question, what incubators can do for top flight underwriting talent is they can de-risk the enterprise a little bit for you rather than setting up on your own and having to handle everything and having to get the capacity. You can work within an incubator and you can get support in all of those areas. And so I think that's quite material potentially in Europe. I think that will be quite an attractive model, but it's definitely not sort of one size fits all. It is, as you say, just an increasingly rich and supportive ecosystem for MGAs. On the technology side, because it's a significant market now, we're looking at $100 billion plus market in the United States, and we're looking at a 20 billion euro market or thereabouts in Europe with high growth rates. That is attracting all of the sort of organizations that you talked about. But on the technology side, it's attracting technology companies that are looking to tailor offerings for MGAs. And we're going to see more of that. And we're going to see these really interesting collaborations between technology companies and MGAs, or MGAs that have some technology at the heart of their operations to price risks better, provide a better customer service. And so I think that's the evolution that we're going to see.
You have more options. You don't have to remortgage your house necessarily these days. You just have to make that commitment and, put that business plan together and talk to someone. It might be as simple as that.
And creating the forum for those conversations is exactly what we want to do at FASE. I mean, the other thing we've been exploring and are really keen to do is to facilitate those conversations. It's not literally just saying, let's hold a big event, and we are going to hold some big events for MGAs and capacity providers to meet and talk. But we're going to see if we can do some prep work ahead of those events for both parties so that they can really have efficient meetings and constructive meetings and not waste any time. So I think there's a lot we can do in that space as well.
Most of the best trade associations within the insurance industry, obviously they're convening people virtually, but they're always putting on events, and they're often defined by the big events that they run, which obviously might be helpful because they're a good way of you defraying your costs as well. If they're successful events, it can be very helpful, and it keeps the cost of membership down to all your members as well. And you're providing a forum that everyone needs and is looking forward to. And of course, all the service providers are there, all the capacity providers are there, all the other enablers, all the brokers and all the lawyers and all the other people that we need are there. There are many successful pan-European events in other spheres within insurance. So we would expect to see a FASE event, an annual event, that kind of thing, a big thing.
Yeah, we will be having what we're going to be calling the MGA Rendezvous, slightly cheekily taking a leaf out of the Rendezvous de Septembre, the reinsurers gathering. But that is for a good reason as well, Mark, which is that we want it to be very much focused on networking. There will be some good presentations. There'll be a formal part of the event, but the broader focus will be on this facilitated networking, if you like, where people can come together. I think we've seen all of these events that take place now. I think the industry feels that that's a more efficient way to operate than having all these bilateral meetings, and spending a lot of time in airplanes. I mean, sometimes obviously there's a crucial role for that, but I think that that's what the driver of growth in a lot of these events has been. And obviously, MGAs and capacity providers are symbiotic. They have to work together. They have to come together. And so I think there's real value in events that bring them together.
Well, I can sort of picture the format. There'll be a few things going on in the main arena. There'll be lots of spin-off events that are all simultaneously going on. But at the same time, there'll be a sort of expo center for some of the people who've taken a big stand or who are providing services to MGAs in Europe or looking to do more. And also, it sounds like lots of tables and places where people can have quick half-hour meetings, that kind of thing, which they've booked in weeks in advance, and they've filled up their agenda with meeting after meeting to meet new people, to meet potential new capacity providers, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And if they can have a sense before they go that, I'm confident this will be a really worthwhile meeting, because we have some sense of, if you're an MGA, we've got some sense of the risk appetite of the carrier that we're meeting. And if you're a carrier, you've got some decent sense of the risk focus of the MGA that you're meeting. And so that kind of, as I say, that sort of facilitation with some exchanging of information beforehand, I think will be valuable. So you won't have wow, that was half an hour of my life I could have got back.
Yeah, it's far more focused. You can do your prep before you go, get a full agenda of really good meetings, and then learn some other things. Of course, there'll be some sessions that you really want to go to because there's something you're particularly interested in that has caught your attention. And there you might meet some other interesting people, etc. And of course, we should all make sure we have coffee and drinks as well to facilitate random encounters, which are often very valuable as well. Sounds like sort of quite a big scale type show.
I hope it'll be a substantial event. It's going to be taking place in Barcelona this year. And yeah, we're looking forward to a great event. There are other events that over time we're going to look to organize. The MGAA in the UK holds very valuable broker events. And one of the main constituencies, obviously, for MGAs in Europe is the broker community and helping ensure that they understand the role that MGAs play and the value that MGAs bring, both for the market as a whole and individual MGAs.
Many brokers have an MGA division anyway.
They often have that involvement in the market as well. And so I think that will be part of what we'll be looking to organize as well.
That's good. I think we've got a clear idea of what to expect. So Barcelona, have you got an idea?
It'll be in May, the 11th and 12th of May in Barcelona.
Occasionally on the podcast, I get traditional balance sheet carrier. I mean, it's varying. A lot of them obviously are very big backers of delegated authority underwriting of managing general agents. Occasional person says to me, well, look, I think there's just been too many formed recently. And now that the market's softening a bit, margins are going to be compressed, and then we're going to have a bit of a squeeze out. What would you say to people like that?
I would say that in certain markets at certain times that I'm sure is the case. So you'll have that kind of concertina effect within any market. But the broad direction of travel, for the reasons that we've been talking about, I think is for continuing growth in the MGA space. And then there are a couple of things that are going on within that market. There's obviously some consolidation, and I think potential for some significant consolidation in Europe as smaller MGAs become part of bigger platforms and more groups are seeking to build a true pan-European presence in this market. But as we've seen in the US as well, that is not deterring new MGAs starting up. And those new MGAs may be starting up on an individual basis, building their business from the ground up, or teams may be joining incubators and seeking to grow in that way. And so this is all part of the evolution of the market, all of it, I think, tending towards growth in the market. But there will certainly be spaces that become too crowded at certain points. And we've seen that definitely in the US. And that's just the normal overshoot the market.
What we've been describing, hasn't it? It's been the ability for somebody to become a professional underwriter who only does underwriting. Then ultimately, everything's Darwinian in the end. If you're not as good an underwriter as you thought you were going to be, then you won't have that right to be an underwriter. And that's just natural. There's just natural competition.
It is a very creative, disruptive market in that way, I think, the MGA market. So the turnover of MGAs in that sense is more rapid than insurance companies.
And of course, if something's lighter, it's less of a thud if it doesn't work either.
Absolutely. And then people can reinvent themselves maybe and find something that does work better or whatever. But that's actually part of the health of the market, right? That is part of the vibrancy of the market. That's why it's an exciting place. If everybody was a success and they were all plodding along at sort of 3% growth or 2% growth or whatever, it wouldn't be the same sort of market.
And of course, some of these things are very niche, and sometimes those niches are actually too small. It might be okay for one MGA to specialize in insuring that niche. But if another one turns up, then it's definitely too small for two of them.
Well, this is where I think Europe becomes very interesting because, you're writing professional indemnity business in Valencia or Schleswig-Holstein or wherever it may be. And I'd like FASE to help you think about how you might be able to write it in Poitiers or Milan or wherever to expand internationally. And then also from a capacity point of view, if you're thinking of writing something else, another line, and your existing capacity providers may not be up for that, then obviously we want to be able to help introduce you to capacity providers through FASE, have the opportunity to meet capacity providers that could support you in that, even if you're actually planning to stay local. So whether you just want to be a local player where you are, or you want, maybe, as you say, your niche is too small locally and you want to think about it on a broader stage, hopefully that will be part of the evolution of the market to which FASE can contribute, that you'll be able to think bigger.
We certainly would expect you to see those sort of associate members who are carriers, for example, who are looking to be introduced through you to new MGAs and vice versa. We should certainly see that as a really core feature. What about the data side of it? Another prime thing that a trade body can do, for example, that the IUA did 10 to 15 years ago, no one had ever quantified the size of the company market. And then the IUA realized that that was a very sensible thing for it to do, as it was representing that company market. It was quite nice to be able to represent that and get home to a politician or somebody that you're lobbying to explain to them, actually, this is a £50 billion market or whatever it is now. And again, you said the 20 billion euro number. Again, will that be another core thing of to keep score of what the size of that market is and to project what the total addressable market might become?
Absolutely. Yeah, we will want to do that when we've got a strong membership. We're looking to 200 or so MGAs at least by the end of next year. So that will be a substantial portion of the market from which we will be able to generalize quite a lot of information about the growth rate of the market, the size of the market. And that'll be a varied picture across different countries as well. So it'll be very good to have that sense as well. You know, how big is the market in Germany? How fast is the market growing in Germany? And there are some high-level statistics about this at the moment, but it is challenging to get that data. I think that'll be a key role. We're looking to produce a report at the beginning of 2027 that really brings that all together. And to your point, that's very valuable, I think, for the market as a whole, because you can really see the weight of the MGA market. It's already substantial, but it'll be more substantial and we'll have real data on it.
How many staff have you got at the moment, and what would be the ideal sort of secretariat of FASE once you're fully up and running?
I think we will be at 5 or 6 people next year. I don't think it's going to be any larger than that. And we're going to be growing quite carefully as far as that's concerned. We definitely will want some really good support on the event side and on the data management side as well. And obviously providing all the services that we're aiming to provide. There's a lot of work to be done in sharing best practices and helping organizations, particularly in those parts of Europe where MGAs are less developed. Good example is the role of captives, right? The role of reinsurance captives potentially in your capacity stack and how you should think about that. And if you look at the US market, that's pretty sophisticated in the US. And so I think there's a lot that we can share on topics like that. So we will have the team, and the goal, Mark, is to have the team that is well able to deliver all of that.
This is how we do it in the UK. Here's a model contract for an MGA agency agreement. Here's a sort of fairly standard one. This is how generally done in the UK. Obviously, if you were in Belgium, you'd have to talk with a Belgian lawyer about how you could apply that or whether any of that would be applicable in your jurisdiction. But again, that's the sort of thing you can be help facilitating.
Yeah, and to be very clear, the challenge for us is to bring the right people into the tent and put them together and help them do those things. It's not to create a huge staff within FASE that purports to be able to do those things. It's really to leverage the expertise that our members have. One of the things that I hope will be very valuable to our members is that every journey that an MGA has with a carrier is a slightly different journey. How did they first get to know one another? How did they build their business? To your point, what are the kind of underpinnings of that relationship from a contractual point of view, and how was that put together? Were there bumps on the road as their business developed together? And where do they see it going? Now, I think that those are inherently very interesting stories, will be very interesting stories for our members to hear about. So we're going to be creating some video content around those. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to create a kind of library of these that will be very valuable to our members, because there's such a variety with MGAs, and such a variety of different relationships with capacity providers that can play out. But if you can crystallize that into some stories like that.
Yes, rather than being a standards body, you're just going to be the forum where people can talk to each other and learn best practice off each other. Like, for example, has anybody ever agreed exactly on how a profit commission should be paid out in year 4?
Right.
No one has ever agreed on that, certainly in my experience as a broker. And I don't think anyone ever quite will, but it would be hugely valuable for someone who's about to start an MGA and obviously predicated on hopefully making lots of profit commission sometime in year 4 or year 3, whenever it might accrue and might get paid out. Yes, it would be hugely valuable for someone who's just starting out to know where those lines might be drawn.
Yeah, I mean, supposing we have 50 of those stories and they're within the member portal. They're only accessible to FASE members, but you are a relatively new MGA. You're thinking about how you should build your business. I think those stories hopefully will be really interesting, valuable, and fun to access. And also, the MGAs and the capacity providers, I think, are quite keen to talk about what they do in those terms as well, because the capacity providers can talk about the value that they're bringing to the MGAs, and the MGAs can talk about the value that they're bringing to capacity providers. So I think that's a kind of win-win. But if you go back to the idea of a sort of facilitation role for FASE, I think that's really important. I mean, we are going to be talking constantly to our members about what can we do for you that will help you. It's really not a matter of us kind of trying to foist things on the membership. It's going to come from the membership, and that will evolve. I have no idea. We should talk in a year's time about how it's evolved, because there may be some really interesting ways that we haven't envisaged in this conversation.
If you were called in to construct a federation of underwriting agencies in Europe, this is what you start with. But of course, it's bound to evolve, and it's bound to be different. It's bound to develop in slightly different ways in different places. And 10 years' time, I'm sure it'll end up being completely different.
One thing that's interesting, it's not sort of completely obvious, but the Tower of Babel has collapsed, which is fantastic. There's always been this Tower of Babel, and Europe has been a great example of Tower of Babel, where, languages are an issue, have always been an issue. That's part of the fragmentation of the European market. And technology is really helping to address that now. So I think that some of what we're doing is much easier than it would have been 10 years ago if we'd had to translate it laboriously from English into all the languages of all our members around Europe. So that's a sort of, in a sense, an obstacle we don't face. And the other thing, to your point, is that there are a lot of these organizations already in Europe, but around the world, from which we can see what they've done and what's added value and how we can help our members. And so that's a big part of what we're doing, paying close attention to what the existing MGA associations do. But then it's going to be different in Europe. There are going to be dimensions of it that are unique to particular markets and things we haven't yet thought about.
William, I think I've come to the end of my questions. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and good luck with everything you're doing. Obviously, these things, yes, it's a sort of a ground-up movement that you're manifesting. There's a need for this to exist, and so therefore it has come into being. And it's going to be really interesting to see what goes on. And Barcelona in May sounds very nice. So yes, I might see you down there.
We should have a glass of cava together. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yes. But thanks so much for coming on the show. We'll have all the links to all of your websites and everything else. And so if anyone wants to get involved, they know where to find you. But just thanks for coming on the show. And I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about in future.
Love to, Mark. Thank you very much. Been very nice to chat.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, don't forget to subscribe or leave a like or a review or recommendation on whatever podcast platform you used to access this programme. These really help get the word out. Before we go, just a quick reminder that advertising slots are available here and in other places in the Voice of Insurance podcasts. Podcasting is the fastest growing medium and attracts a high quality audience of key decision makers. It's also an intimate medium where you, the listener, are right in the room with me and the interview subjects. Needless to say, that means it's a great way of getting your message out directly to an audience because you know you've got their full attention. It's also very cost effective. So get in touch with Mark at thevoiceofinsurance.com to find out how you could be speaking directly to the industry. The Voice of Insurance podcast is produced in association with Advantage Go, enabling enterprise scale underwriting through a single pane of glass. Voice of Insurance is produced by me, Mark Gagan. Music was written by Anna Gagan and produced by Carlos Gagan. Check out more podcasts and written comment pieces at www.thevoiceofinsurance.com.